Hey, good evening, everyone. It's CJ. Sorry about that. I was muted for a second. We hit the live button. Yeah, just wanted to jump on. I know it's really late for some people, but I took a huge nap this afternoon, and I'm wide awake and wired. So what's up? Shout out to those that are in. So Crypto King, who's always in the house. Welcome, lovely man. Hopefully you're doing well. Boring Head. Yeah, I was muted before I hit the go live button. So yeah, but hey, just wanted to follow up to an earlier discussion in regards to this COVID-19 and the vaccination. You know, many of you aware we've had conversation earlier in this week in regards to statements that were made by Alan Dershowitz in regards to the mandatory vaccination potentially coming up. And there's a great debate out there that Dershowitz, and I applaud his efforts. You know, he's not drawing back. He's not shunning from, going on television, doing interviews and discussing this. And where this all stems from is from the conversation that was had that he, had a discussion in regards to his views on a potential vaccine. So let's kick this off by just covering what took place. So this is what Dershowitz, again, and if you know Dershowitz, bio, again, he's regarded as a civil rights expert, a conservative, a constitutional law expert. So let's go through first his discussion with Tucker Carlson in regards to his opinion. Let's let this play.
Scrambling to create a working vaccine for the coronavirus. If they succeed in doing that, it will be one of the fastest rollouts of a vaccine in human history. Now, in this country of 330 million people, some will not want to take it. Some will have religious objections. Some will be nervous about the effects of it. So what happens then? Well, retired law professor Alan Dershowitz, a famous civil libertarian, says these objections won't matter. If the government wants to, the government has the right to seize you and inject the vaccine by force.
Let me put it very clearly. You have no constitutional right to endanger the public and spread a disease, even if you disagree. You have no right not to be vaccinated. You have no right not to wear a mask. You have no right to open up your business.
Professor Dershowitz is the author of the book Guilt by Association, among many other books. We're happy to have him on tonight. Professor, thanks so much for coming on.
Well, thank you. The name of the book is Guilt by Accusation. So
by accusation, but I changed the title because I like that one. But no, I'm just kidding. I made a mistake. Thanks for correcting it. So I introduced you, obviously correctly. You're probably the most famous civil libertarian in America. And I understand the argument that you're making, which is you don't have a right to endanger other people. Your right to punch ends with the tip of my nose. I understand the argument. But there is also, in the specific case of a vaccine, a risk to the individual taking it because vaccines are good for populations. But in some rare cases, sometimes not that rare, they can hurt people. That's factually true. Does the government still have a right to endanger you by forcing you to take it?
The Supreme Court has said yes. And if the case came to the Supreme Court today, they would say yes. It would either be 9-0 or 8-1. It is not a debatable issue constitutionally. Look, they have a right to draft you and put your life in danger to help the country. The police power of the state is very considerable. But let's distinguish between the constitutional issue on the one hand, which is settled, and the moral issue on the other hand. I think one can make a plausible argument that nobody should be required to be subject to a dangerous vaccination to help other people. That's a plausible argument. And I think we should continue to debate that. I wouldn't require people to take the vaccine unless it was proved very, very safe. Now, any injection can cause, obviously, infection at the site. Any pill can cause a problem. But in general, if the vaccine is deemed extremely safe, then the state does have a right to compel you to take it. Because remember, vaccines work on a theory of mass inoculation. You're not taking the vaccine to help yourself. If there were a vaccine developed for cancer or a heart condition, obviously, you and I would have a right to say, no, we have a right to die. I believe you have a right to die. But I don't believe you have a right to be Typhoid Mary and spread it. Look, if you don't want to take the vaccine, you have an option. You can stay in quarantine. But what you don't have the right to do is circulate in society without being vaccinated if the vaccine is proved to be very safe. And that could be a
Right.
matter
But
of
proved to be, and that's I think is stumbling about. There is so much lying about vaccines, probably on all sides, but there certainly is lying about vaccines because public health authorities don't want people, they want people to take them, and I get it, but people are nervous. Let me ask you though, by the same reasoning, since we all, we have in effect socialized medicine, we're all affected by the health choices our neighbors make. Why should we allow people to eat Little Debbie snack cakes when we're all paying for diabetes treatment?
Well,
Seriously.
I've just written another book about that. It'll be out in a month. It's called The Case for Liberalism in an Age of Extremism, in which I have a chapter on that. And I say, no, that argument doesn't work. It's the
Good.
old John Stuart Mill argument. And you have to just say you can never make somebody do anything only for their own good, even if it has collateral impacts on the rest of us. No man is an island. We know that. And in the world in which we live, if you get fat and get sick, we pay for it. That's not enough as a civil libertarian. But the spread of a deadly, highly contagious illness is enough for a civil libertarian. But I want to have a rule of reason. I don't believe in shutting down a whole society or putting people in jail for not wearing masks. You have to have a rule of reason. If the vaccine is very effective and very safe, I would start, by the way, by having people volunteer first. I wouldn't compel them first, but you might get to a point where healthy people, without any risk, considerable risk to themselves, say no, and then if the state decides to compel them, they would win in the Supreme Court of the United States. That's my expert prediction as a constitutional lawyer.
Well, I want to pause it there before I continue it. And obviously, he's arguing for the sake of, the Supreme Court. He doubles down in another conversation with Del Bigtree in regards to the Supreme Court and what he estimates would be the vote. Let me shut this down. But I think it's a very important debate that we need to start assessing and sizing up like right now. Like we cannot wait to have this discussion because they're already planting the seeds in regards to the timeline of this vaccine, the speed up of the process. Yet we have new information coming about daily from the CDC in regards to COVID-19 that it's not on the surface. It's not as contagious as we originally thought. We see the death rate continue to plummet. We see the infection rate, people who are asymptomatic in regards to COVID. And the idea around this forced vaccination and the timing of this is just crucial, especially as we navigate through this, because we know there's going to be, for the most part, a lot of government, whether it's municipalities or federal, they're going to say, or even employment, they're going to start mandating these things that, hey, look, I think it was MasterCard that announced that they're not going to bring any workers back at this point until there is some type of vaccination. And I don't feel comfortable with the language that we're hearing time and time again in regards to, we're hearing it from everyone that, we can't return to a normal until there's a vaccine or a vaccination, which at this point, in my opinion, is unwarranted. There's no need for that. And I think we need to begin the debate now. And again, like I said, several people logging in right now. So thank you for that. Hey, Nick, what's up, buddy? Tim. So thank you guys for joining in. I know it's late or early wherever you guys are, but like I said earlier, I took a huge nap and I'm wide awake. And I had the opportunity to come back and listen to this debate that Del had with Alan in regards to his views. And I applaud him for going out and doing these debates and these discussions. And I think it's a very formidable question that we need to begin this right now. I know for the most part how people feel that are probably tuning in here. However, we have a population for the most part that is still stuck in that fear paradigm, if you will, that fear mongering that's associated with COVID, that in my opinion is unwarranted. And that's why we need to begin this discussion now. So let's fire up this discussion, this debate that Del had with Dershowitz. So here we go.
It is my pleasure and honor to have this moment to speak with you, Mr. Alan Dershowitz. Obviously, watched you on the news. I've seen court cases, some of the biggest in the world that you've been involved with. Today, I actually want to discuss something that's gone somewhat viral in the news. There was an interview that you did where you were asked, about what rights we have as we're in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic. People are deciding not to wear face masks and there's the possibility of a vaccine out in the future. So I want to read a quote from that interview, which is really what I want to focus on today. You essentially said when it came to vaccines, if you refuse to be vaccinated, the state has the power to literally take you to a doctor's office and plunge a needle into your arm. You then went on to say that I would like to see a government mandate, and if it is the safe vaccine is developed for COVID-19, I hope it's mandated, and I will defend it and will argue that in the Supreme Court of the United States. I just want to make sure I haven't misrepresented your statements in any way, have I?
No, that's absolutely accurate. It's a view I've held for 55 years. I wrote about it literally half a century ago. My view is very simple. You cannot be compelled to take a vaccine that's designed just to help you. If we develop a vaccine to prevent cancer or a heart attack, you have a choice. You have a right to die, you have a right to live, you have a right to take the vaccine or not. But if the vaccine is not intended to help you only, it's intended to prevent you from spreading the disease, the fatal, highly contagious disease to other people, then the state has the right to compel you to do it. The Supreme Court held that in 1905 in a case called Jacobson versus Massachusetts, when the smallpox vaccine was at issue. And, you know, I grew up during the polio vaccine. I lost a friend who died after being in an iron lung. And our heroes were, of course, Salk and Sabin and the others who invented the vaccine that cured polio. So if the vaccine is safe and if it's designed to prevent the disease from spreading to other innocent people, then you have no choice. Look, theoretically, you have a choice. You don't have to have the vaccine. You can just be quarantined in your house for the rest of the pandemic. What you don't have the right to do is not have the vaccine come out and contaminate me. As I put it in a different context, every American has the right to inhale a cigarette, but you don't have the right to exhale it in my face. The right to swing your fist ends at the tip of my nose, and the right to infect your lungs with COVID-19 ends at the area around my nose, my eyes, and my mouth.
I'm going to pause it there for a minute because I think he's already lost somewhat of the discussion, the debate in regards to this. I mean, we've seen time and time again how many times the CDC, the FDA has gotten this information wrong in regards to COVID-19, right? That's very well documented. Time after time, they've gotten it wrong. And who's to state that who's the undermining or who's the authoritative figure that's going to determine what a vaccine is necessary? He said that if it's an individual type vaccine, then maybe those aren't warranted by the Supreme Court. But if it's for the common good, for the greater good, then it should be mandated. Okay, well, who's going to determine that? What authoritative figure are we going to trust? The CDC, the FDA? I mean, you got to be kidding me, right? So, and again, he's stating that the Supreme Court has already upheld. Let's not forget the last time that there was some type of epidemic where they did launch some type of vaccination program, the injuries that were occurred because of that. So let's let this play. By the way, I just have to state this. We're playing this video. We're discussing it. So it is covered under the fair use rights. I don't think that the high wire would even care regardless. But let's continue this debate.
So that's my civil liberties position in a nutshell.
Okay, I think I understand that. And so, but when, just to make it clear, you are referencing smallpox and polio. I mean, smallpox was an incredibly infectious disease. It was also astoundingly deadly, right? And so when we're talking about coronavirus right now, the argument in science is we're talking about an illness that perhaps kills 0.1 to 0.3% of people. I suppose if we wanted to argue, could go as high as the least conservative, maybe 0.5%. Smallpox was off the charts. I mean, it was so much. Would we agree that that was a far more deadly illness when we're talking about, Supreme Courts and saying that, forcing a vaccine and the necessity of it? We're really talking about two different diseases, aren't we?
But the Supreme Court didn't focus on that. The Supreme Court focused on the conceptual issue of whether the state can compel you to take a medical procedure, not for your own good, but for the good of society in general. Reasonable people could disagree how serious the COVID-19 is. It's killed a lot of people, particularly a lot of old people. It has a particularly devastating impact on minority populations. And the question is, does the state have the power to make the decision, take it away from you, as to whether it will try to prevent the spread of the disease. And the Supreme Court, I think today, would be 9-0 and say yes. Conceivably 8-1. I don't know how Justice Thomas would vote, but plainly those justices, for example, who said you have no right to die, there were several of them on the Supreme Court, would I think take that to its logical conclusion, and that is you have no right to inflict death on an unwilling person who could be saved if you were willing to be vaccinated. It's all abstract, obviously. We don't know any particular person who'd be saved, but it's a public policy issue. And I think the Constitution gives the states enormous public health discretion under the police power to do what's reasonable to prevent the spread of illness.
So keep in mind, he's stating there the police powers, that the Constitution warrants this, and it's very concerning. And just in regards to his opinion about this, we know the influence that Dershowitz has as an attorney. I won't go into the entire Epstein thing, but you guys all know that, correct? But what I will state is that this gentleman served as the constitutional expert for President Trump during the last impeachment, right? I mean, you can't deny that. He was the lead attorney to argue the constitutional right of impeachment, in regards to that going down. So obviously, Alan has a lot of influence on the political landscape. I think his argument is flawed in regards to the constitutional authority of the government to mandate vaccines, but I do have a lot of concern in regards to the Supreme Court and what they would back up, and it's a great concern. It really is.
Well, and I'm not a lawyer. You clearly would understand sort of the legal ramifications. I think I'm more interested, though, in your personal opinion.
Right.
Just when you do think about, when you reference smallpox and polio, I'm just curious, do you personally see COVID-19 at the same level of danger as you see smallpox and polio?
I don't know the answer to that, and I don't think any of us knows the answer to it. At the moment, obviously, fewer people have died than died smallpox. Also, smallpox was weaponized. We know that it was used against Native Americans, whether the stories are true or false. Certainly, it's in our history. Smallpox infected blankets were given to Native Americans, and I suspect there's some truth to that. Also, we have to be very concerned about the weaponization of communicable diseases. So I don't know. I hope it's less dangerous, but I think the state has the power to move in quickly to prevent its spread at the earliest possible time. Look, I was in Israel when this first broke out, and I was with Prime Minister Netanyahu, who was right on the eve of the election. And he told my wife and me that they were going to close down the country. My daughter was supposed to meet us in Israel, and she was kept out. She couldn't come in because Netanyahu decided to become very, very aggressive. And it had an enormous impact. Israel has had a much, much smaller percentage of cases than other countries and other surrounding countries. So actions taken by the state can have an impact, and vaccination is one of them. I think that the President of the United States has said he's moving in a kind of Manhattan Project kind of way toward trying to develop cures, vaccines, anything that can reduce the impact of the disease, not only on health, that's the primary issue, but on the economic health of the country as well. And the states and the government have enormous discretion as well to solve economic problems. I'm not suggesting for a moment that the state would have a right to inject you against your will to improve the economy. I think I would take a very different view on that. But if the state can demonstrate a strong connection between a safe and effective vaccine and reducing the death rate, the illness rate, and the devastating impact the disease has, I think the Supreme Court would sustain that. And I think most civil libertarians would agree. Now, I got a lot of reaction, some very positive, some anti-Semitic. I mean, somebody called me the K word and other words and said I was going to burn in hell, and he wanted to put me in concentration camps. Others were very thoughtful. I got a very thoughtful response from Bobby Kennedy, who I've known for a long time. In fact, we agreed to debate this issue now because I think it's a debatable issue.
Yeah.
And I would certainly never try to stop anybody from expressing anti-vaccination views. That's part of the dialogue, part of the debate. We should encourage debate and dialogue while also encouraging science.
I want to pause it there and, and give Alan credit for that because, he's open to the debate. He's open to the ideas that we do need to discuss these things, the safety, the rights for that. But in my opinion, it shouldn't even be a debate, right? It should be more about individual freedom, individual liberty in regards to the state being able to apply these mandatory vaccinations that are occurring. I'm going to let this play for a minute, but as he goes on to speak about this, he is going to talk about currently, like for how this affects me and my family on a personal level is that, we do currently file for the religious exemption, in the States, because we know that many schools require the vaccine records. We know that certain states have, mandated vaccination in regards to healthcare services, whether it's California, New York. And my fear is that, Alan is providing them the ammunition to expand upon that in the state legislature, right? Because he's basically validating that the states have the right to do this. So let's let this conversation continue.
To develop an effective and safe vaccine.
So when we talk about this issue, I'm really, because your opinion, all of that is true. And we do see treatments being, developed, and we're looking at studies of hydroxychloroquine, remdesivir, all of these things. I think everyone would agree any way we can, mitigate death and limit death. I think that everyone would be on the same page there. But vaccinations does take on a different role when we start saying it's going to be forced upon you, right? When we aren't talking about forcing hydroxychloroquine on anybody or remdesivir or any treatment like that. So vaccinations sort of fall into a really different category where we're starting to take away consent or informed consent. It doesn't matter after you've been informed of whatever possible good or bad. When we came out of the Nuremberg trials, of course, the Nuremberg Code says you should be involved in that decision, that you should be told all the benefits and all the negative side effects. And then and only then, you are the one that gets to make that choice. And the way you discuss vaccination really overrides the Nuremberg Code and says, no, when it comes to other people's health and you're putting them at risk, then we can override your choice and your need to be informed. But let me just specifically ask you, since, what I'm curious about is you said you would like to see this mandate. Is there any group right now that you imagine as you're watching the trials and we do see, numbers coming in about the death rates, and it does appear that it's going to be lower than smallpox for sure, but I'm not going to really grill into you there. What I'm curious about is there any group right now that you see should be excluded from that type of mandate? Is there anyone that you would say just right up front, look, when I said they can drag you to the hospital and plunge a needle in your arm, I didn't mean for this specific group? Is there anyone in your mind right now that fits that scenario that would be exempt from, just by nature, from the program?
Let me start by saying who should not be exempt. Religious people who have a religious objection should not be exempt for two reasons. First, the religious objection is nonsense. Christians, Jews can have no religious objection. Look at the Bible, the Torah, the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible. It has chapter after chapter about how to deal with people with communicable diseases. It requires that you take lepers and put them outside of the wall. There's all kinds of descriptions about how you know whether a person still continues to be contagious. And the concept of choose life in the Bible, which is often quoted against abortion by Christians, but surely Christian theology, Jewish theology, Muslim theology, all the Mosaic religions, the Abrahamic religions, all support preferring life. So I wouldn't exempt anybody on religious grounds any more than I would exempt people on religious grounds from other obligations under the law. I would exempt people who have a medical problem, which would be exacerbated by taking the vaccine. I mean, if, for example, give you an example, this drug that President Trump is taking apparently has specific side effects on people who have problems of arrhythmias. If that would be true, for example, of the vaccine, yes, then people would come in and with a medical doctor's statement saying, no, the vaccine is too dangerous for that person. Let's remember first, we vaccinate everybody in this country. When you're born, you're vaccinated. You get vaccinated almost immediately. In many states, you can't go to public schools unless you've been vaccinated. In some places, you can't do other things unless. So vaccine is the norm. It's what we've accommodated our laws to certainly for the last 150 years since the vaccines for smallpox were developed. It would take a change of the law now to say that we're not going to mandate vaccines if they're safe and effective. Now, I wouldn't.
Okay, so my question to Mr. Dershowitz is, if vaccines are so safe and effective, then why do we see a decline in health in terms of our life expectancy? Why do we see a decline? Why do we see that in the United States we have one of the worst chronic health care ever as it relates to just preventable medicine? We don't see anything in regards to any type of declines, but yet we see an increase in vaccine schedules. So if that's the case, then why don't we go ahead and remove the product liability exemption that vaccine manufacturers have? Let's go ahead and do that now. Let's go ahead and Trump can remove I believe it was, don't quote me on this, but I think it was an executive order or a court or Congress passed legislation that allowed vaccine manufacturers to be exempt from product liability. Let's revoke that. Let's do that now, and then let's see how many companies are jumping in to manufacture these vaccines. So his argument that vaccines are safe is flawed in itself. So let's let this continue.
Compel them unless there was extensive testing, unless the consensus was overwhelming that it was safe and effective. But if those criteria were met and legislation was enacted by a majority and upheld by the courts, then I would go ahead with the mandate without exceptions, except medical exceptions.
Well, you just made, I think, some really good points when you say that you would like to see some form of robust safety studies. It would have to have a very large consensus around it. I mean, you have to imagine, I would guess that really is in jeopardy when we see how this is being described, that they are rushing the science. Dr. Fauci said that we have skipped animal trials and that we are going to attempt to have this vaccine in 12 to 18 months. Donald Trump is now saying that we're using a warp speed approach and that he hopes to be able to have the military able to deliver this vaccine by autumn. Now, you seem to be well aware of the fact that, when we look at science, when we look at pharmaceutical products, usually those are tested using a double-blind, inert placebo study. That's something that already most of these vaccine trials are not doing, particularly the Moderna, which is the leading product right now, does not have a placebo group. Does that bother you at all that we're rushing science and not really using the scientific method as we know it?
Well, I think we ought to rush the science, and then I think we ought to be very, very careful. And I would try to get the vaccine as soon as possible, but I would not impose it on people right away. I would start with voluntary compliance. I would expect that most people would want to get it. But if a person refused to get it, I would certainly allow those people to get at the end of the line and wait until we had double-blind testing and placebo tests and all of that. I think you do have a right to demand of your country that they follow the scientific method. But I suspect that the way we're going to unroll it, I think, is going to be first on a voluntary basis. And in the end, we'll get to the issue of how to deal with those people. And I think it will be a relatively small percentage. Certainly, it'll be under 10%. Will it be under 1%? I don't know. Who will?
Well, let me just say that polls right now are saying that 70% of Americans say they will take it. 30% are saying they won't take it. There's been several polls in that approximate area. So 30% obviously leaves you short of herd immunity, right? Which is the goal. But let me be clear. So you were saying then, when you said you could be taken to a hospital, they'll plunge a needle in your arm, and that you would like to see the government make a law to sort of enforce that mandate, that you are now saying that you don't mean at the end of this year or in the next 12 to 18
Oh, no,
months that's something you would like to see further down the road.
no doubt. What I want to see first is develop the vaccine. As you're developing the vaccine, follow the scientific method as best as possible, and let it be a.
Okay, develop the vaccine. Why? For a virus that has killed probably less than what 0.3% at this point. For a virus that, for the most part, if people eat healthy, if they maintain their diet, exercise, perhaps dose up on vitamin D, that could be preventive. Why are we even having this discussion in regards to a vaccine? Is it the perceived safety, no different than the mask that people are choosing to wear? It just amazes me when you look at those statistics at 70%. And again, I'm all about medical freedom. So if you want to volunteer and go get the vaccine, that's up to you. But again, I think it just is the conditioning, right? We've been so conditioned that the government knows best for me. The government knows what I need to do. And it probably explains why we're in the situation that we are, that we have people that are fall asleep at the wheel, and we just continue to blindly believe that government is going to provide the solutions to a lot of the problems that are occurring. And that's just so far from the truth. Let this continue.
Process. And at the beginning, let the most people who are most vulnerable, for example, elderly people like me, to volunteer to take it right away. I would immediately volunteer to take it, even if the risks were slightly higher than I would accept for my children, because at my age, the risk-benefit ratio is a little bit different. So I would go to my doctors and I'd make a medical decision, a careful decision, and would take the vaccine, but I wouldn't impose it on my children and my grandchildren until we were probably a little further along in the testing process. So I don't think we should be rushing to plunge needles in the arms of the most unwilling people first. I don't want to do what General Hershey did with the draft when I was in law school and after law school. He first drafted the dissenters. You don't do that. You draft first the people who want to fight the fight, and then you get to the dissenters at the end. I would follow the same course here. And I would encourage debate. I would encourage more debate. I've agreed, as I said, to debate Bobby Kennedy, who's an old friend. I was somebody who worked with his father many, many years before that. I worked on his campaign when he was murdered. I'm a great admirer and friend of many of the Kennedys. And I'm looking forward to my debate with Bobby. We are two reasonably intelligent people who can disagree and still have a friendship after our disagreement. And I'm willing to learn from him. And maybe I'll change my mind about certain issues, and maybe he'll change his mind. But I'm not rushing into anything. But look, I do think theoretically, the state has the power to compel compliance if the goal, and it's reasonable, is to save other people's human life.
I appreciate that. And I have to say, I think just based on what you just said, a lot of people's shoulders just relax and they feel like, that's a much more reasonable statement than they thought that you'd made. But I do want to point out that you have a very powerful voice, and that voice has just gone across America and planted this seed that you really believe in a vaccine mandate and want to see that happen. I'm happy to know that you're willing to see that sort of stretched out so that more studies could go along. But let's go ahead and jump to that hypothetical moment where, let's say 2 or 3.
Bingo. And that's my concern. And this is my first part up to this podcast, so I'm listening for the first time up to this point. But I was just so compelled to, jump on and begin the debate now that needs to take place. But the idea, what Dell's stating here, is that this guy has significant influence, that he's planting the seed, if you will. And I had a robust conversation and post, and many people that were, I guess, from the pro-Trump agenda. And I don't want to, I'm being very careful. I don't want to politicize too much, but my argument was that by signing an executive order last September, streamlining the DOJ, I'm sorry, not the DOJ, the Department of Defense, and several other government institutions to streamline the vaccination process, the Operation Warp Speed, we're going to use the military to deploy this. Guys, how many excuses can we continue to make for this administration? And yet, granted, I probably believe that Trump doesn't support mandatory vaccination, but yet you don't put the ammunition in the gun, right? And that's big. You can disagree with me. I have no problem with that. But I firmly believe that by speeding up the process, by doing all these things, it could be maybe to get reelected, right? Maybe he's hoping that if I do these things and I show that I'm aggressively attacking this, it'll make me look better, improve my poll numbers, all those things. And I just don't think that COVID warrants that. I'd much rather just have some brutal honesty. And let's face it, Trump, like many people have said, Trump could come out and cure cancer tomorrow, and there'd be people who would slam him for that, right? That people have a right to contact cancer. It's, I have 4 generations of family members that died from cancer, and I have that right. But they're not gonna give the guy a break, right? So let's just have that brutal honesty, and go from there. So let's continue this.
3 years down the road, which, by the way, if this follows the course of MERS or SARS or every other coronavirus we know, it will be gone on its own within 2 years. So it seems like it'll be anticlimactic to finally, be bringing in a vaccine mandate at the point where this thing has handled itself naturally. But I think that's a different point. I'd really like to drill down. So when you say everybody and you excluded, you're not going to exclude people with religious beliefs or anything like that. Let me ask you about children. Because children, you did say that we have a vaccine program for children and that we all get vaccinated. But the truth is really adults don't get vaccinated. There are schedules. The CDC does recommend it. We know that, adults really are not getting the vaccinations that are being recommended by the CDC. There's a real goal by the WHO and the CDC to get adults into either some sort of mandated process just like children. But when we look at COVID-19, when you look at it, every scientist around the world essentially has been saying, including Deborah Birx and Tony Fauci, that children seem to have really no effect from COVID-19. Even in China, in the hardest hit Wuhan, they were surprised that children weren't even getting sick. So if children don't even get sick from this virus, do you think that they should be injected with the vaccine when they don't actually need it, and they would be perfectly safe if they got the illness itself?
Well, I'll answer with a hypothetical. Let's assume you had a group of people who were genetically immune. They couldn't get the disease. They absolutely couldn't get it. 100% can't get it. But they are carriers and they could spread it. I would require them to have the vaccine, even though it wasn't done for their own benefit. And I think that analogy would apply as well to children. Now, it's difficult because, children can be very vulnerable also to injections. And I would have all kinds of medical exemptions for children if their parents objected. But if the objection were purely ideological or religious, I wouldn't exempt children just because they themselves might not be immune. Remember, children come into contact with their teachers, with their grandparents, with their babysitters, with other people. So you don't want anybody to become a typhoid Mary, to be the person who carries the illness and spreads it to many, many other people. Look, these are all good and important questions, and I'm glad we're having this debate. When I said that thing on that TV interview the other night, the interview was about a completely different subject, and the interviewer just kind of sprung it on me, and I wasn't thinking about how I was going to respond. I hadn't prepared remarks on that. What I did is I said what I've been saying for 50 years and what the Supreme Court said in 1905. And I think this discussion has been much more thoughtful because A, you asked me very thoughtful questions, and B, I came prepared to discuss it, done some more research between yesterday and today, listened to Bobby Kennedy's points of view and other points of view. It's a process. I stand by my view constitutionally that the state does and should have the power to compel people to do things against their will if it's necessary to protect against highly contagious, deadly.
And here's what I feel about his statements in regards to the state and their rights to do that. F you, Dershowitz.
Disease, and reasonable people could debate how contagious, how deadly, all of these things that we
Where's
discussed
Gus when I need
today.
him?
But the principle, I think, is an important one.
Right, but and I agree with you, and I agree that, you are aware, of the Supreme Court's power. But what I'm challenging or questioning is really your desire to see them use that power. When you made the statement that you would like to see this mandate, you took that conversation a little bit of a different place
I did.
from saying, that they could uphold this, and you would agree with it. You say you want to see them do this, and you would want to be the one that would fight this and take this all to the Supreme Court, which is why
That's right.
I'm asking you very important questions, because I think as someone that's going to have that strong an opinion, I'd like to know what your opinion is based on the safety. And so when you just made talked about children, we know that children have no danger whatsoever, really, categorically across the world when it comes to the illness. And as you pointed out, any injection, any vaccine does have a percentage of children or
Right.
adults that will be injured. So are you saying that for some greater good, that it's okay that we are going to put the children in an increased risk position by having them vaccinate when they weren't going to be at risk by getting the illness, that it's okay to increase their risk of death, increase their risk at the beginning of their life, to protect, as you described, the people that are really at risk are the older generation that have already lived their life? Is that a fair decision to make, to put them in that increased risk position?
It's a fair point. I disagree with your empirical assumptions. Number one, we know that children have died as the result of it. Not a lot, but we know they died. We know that this heart condition and these strokes that come out. We also aren't sure whether kids who don't have symptoms now will have symptoms later in life. Second, it doesn't only protect the elderly. Obviously, there are lots of people in their 40s and 50s who are at risk and who
We don't know if they have symptoms now, or we don't know if they will later in life. So let's jab them. Oh my God.
who are dying. But third, I have to answer your conceptual question, and the answer is yes. The very, very slight risk of an infection at the injection point or something else, the state has the power to compel everybody in the society to do it. I think the children have the strongest legal case because they can't make their own cost-benefit analysis. They can't make their own consensual agreement. But I'm saying that even adults who disagree can be compelled. So the argument for children is pretty strong. I want to see more of the science about it as well. I want to see how much impact injecting the children with the vaccine has on the herd immunity and all of that. I think a lot of it is science. And in the end, debate this in front of the state legislatures, and the legislatures may want to have an exception for children under a certain age.
When we talk about children, you pointed out something really clearly, that we don't know this virus, how it will affect them years down the road. But
Right.
The same could be said about the vaccine. When we are talking about a vaccine that I would imagine, if it's going to have any effect on COVID-19 at all, will have to be mandated, for everybody within 2 years or so. So that means we will have no ability. There'll be no science that exists to show the long-term safety implications or health implications of children who, as far as we know, had no issue with the illness. We don't know if the vaccine is going to have long-term issues. We also don't know, for that matter, any adult. When we're talking about rushing this, I think you made a really good point. We don't know what the long-term effects of the illness are, except that we do have a historical reference of what happened with people who've had coronaviruses since the dawn of man, what happened when they got SARS, when they had MERS. We have no idea what will happen to people who get the vaccination. So let me ask you this question, because I do want you to be thinking about these things, because you probably are going to be a voice talking about this. So here's the question. When you say that the FDA, CDC will determine it's safe, and therefore that's the time, we've done the trials, but always in trials, you can't test everybody. And in Moderna's, which is the leading contender right now for the vaccine, they've already excluded people out of their trials because they're going to be at higher risk for having an adverse event, I would imagine. So they are not allowing people with cardiovascular disease. They're not allowing people with obesity into the trial. They're not allowing people with respiratory illnesses. And so I wonder, if we get to the point where we are now going to mandate this vaccine, would you consider then allowing people that have heart conditions or diabetes or obesity to be those that cannot be dragged to a hospital and have a vaccine rammed into their arm?
It's a fair point. It's a fair point. I think it would be fair to argue that anybody who was not part of the group that was subject to the testing there's not enough medical and scientific basis for compelling them to have the vaccine. That seems to me to be a very fair, scientific, as well as legal point. Hopefully, what happens with these tests are, first you exclude the most at-risk group, and eventually, as the tests prove themselves safer and safer, you include more and more and more groups and more people, and hopefully we'll come to a point, as we did with polio, where virtually anybody can take the vaccine. And remember with polio too, I remember this so vividly because I was a young man when it happened, there were two types of vaccines. There was the live vaccine, which I think was a Jonas Salk, and then the vaccine that was not live, which was the Sabin vaccine. And there was great debate about whether people should use the live or the non-live. The live provided better herd immunity. The dead vaccine was a little safer. All of these things were debated and discussed. I remember debating it in my family because my children were 1 or 2 years old at the time. And I remember actually having an opportunity to ask Jonas Salk, who was a friend of the judge I clerked for, about the difference between the live and the other. And so I was privileged to have a personal conversation with Jonas Salk about this. But I think these conversations should continue, and all of these points are good ones that should be included in the dialogue. So thank you very much for a very intelligent conversation about a very complex, difficult, and important issue.
Well, and you see the difficulty, right? Because to make a blanket statement that anyone could be taken and forcibly vaccinated, when we talk about heart disease, that's going to be over 40% of America. When we look at autoimmune disease that's excluded from these trials, that's another 10%. If we get into respiratory illness, so you start seeing that the vaccine is going to have a very difficult time achieving herd immunity, which is the goal. So when you say that this is how the vaccine should be used, I don't see how we get to that goal if we start taking rights away from people where it hasn't actually been properly tested for safety, because I just don't think that we don't see that. So I appreciate you looking at one last question, really.
My point is that we ought to expand the testing. Everybody my age, I'm 81 years old, has some problem, some medical problem somewhere, and yet I want to take the vaccine. So I'm going to follow very carefully who's tested, who's not tested, and hope that there'll come a time when the test will include people within my category so I can safely test it. So again, I think it's going to be a process. It won't be black and white, yes or no.
Well, and my opinion, just so you understand it, is I would really like the focus for these great scientists around the world to make a product exactly for you, for this percentage of people, the 1% that are having any acute reaction at all. When we hear across the world that 99% of people clear this illness without any long-term effects, it seems to me ridiculous to make a product that 99% has got to take a risk with, has got to like get involved with, even though there haven't been safety studies. I would really prefer they make a product that's tested and designed especially for those at risk like yourself. That's my perspective. Let me ask you one last question.
One point to make sure your people understand that 1% of the world population is close to 100 million people. Right. So that's a lot of people to put at risk. If 99% are safe, we don't want to put at risk 100 million people.
No, but that's my point, is we should be making a product for that 100 million people, not for the 7.5 billion people that the other, that don't really need it. And so that's my perspective. Let me just ask you, this question. Since you said that, it would be defendable in the Supreme Court, and I don't really know the laws, can you name a case where forcibly injecting somebody was upheld in a court?
Of course, yes. The Jacobson versus Massachusetts. It took place in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I spent most of my life at Harvard. And Cambridge had an outbreak of smallpox in the first decade of the 20th century. And a group of dissenters, led by a man named Jacobson, took the case to the United States Supreme Court. And in a decision by Justice Harlan, the first Justice Harlan, joined by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and others, said that the state did have the authority and the power. As far as I know of no other case in the federal courts or in leading state courts that's denied that power. So I think right now, the judicial view is fairly unanimous, but you've raised some interesting points that I think good lawyers could really bring to the attention of the authorities. And you might get a decision that is more nuanced and calibrated.
My understanding of Jacobson is Jacobson actually just ruled he didn't want to pay the $5 fine. And the Supreme Court enforced that he had to pay the $5 fine. He was not forced to be vaccinated. I asked you, is there precedent for forcibly vaccinated? Are you equating paying a fine with, as you said, taking someone to the hospital and forcing a vaccine into them, something that I think could be considered battery or wrongful imprisonment? Do those equate? Does paying a fine equate to actual physical retaining and puncturing your skin with a needle? Do you think that those things actually line up?
Of course they don't, but the Jacobson case would have permitted compulsory vaccination. The case does involve only a fine or a small imprisonment, but the ruling of the case would permit the state to do that. And, you know, we do lock up people against their will. We did it for people who had tuberculosis for many, many, many years, and some of them had to be put in hospitals against their will. We did it for people who were mentally ill. We did it for others as well. Before the smallpox vaccine, we did confine smallpox people against their will. No, but you're right. I don't know of any case. Well, there's a terrible case. I would never cite it as a precedent, Justice Holmes' opinion, where he allowed, in a case called Buck versus Bell, for a woman to be sterilized against her will based on mental incompetence. And that was a case that was actually focused on by the Nuremberg principles. But the Nuremberg principles, I've read them carefully, don't apply, were never intended to apply to mandatory vaccination. So, and I do think it's a little bit insulting to the victims of Nazism and the Holocaust to, in any way, and you're not suggesting this, but some have in some of my emails, compare getting a vaccination to being put in a gas chamber or having experimentation done on you against your will, for your children, for no one's good. So the Nuremberg principles, I don't think are applicable, but the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment is applicable, the Equal Protection Clause, the bodily integrity of the Fourth Amendment, all of these.
I'm going to pause it right there because obviously, Alan, being Jewish and everything, he resents people, comparing this to Nazi Germany, to the experimentation, to the things that occurred with the Jewish community. But I don't agree with that, because if you look at the conviction of the Nazi Germany and how they were able to infiltrate, how they were able to convince the public that we're doing this for the greater good, is kind of the same argument that the vaccine has and the mask, that we're doing this for the community. We're doing this for the greater good of everything. So I think his argument's pretty flawed, in regards to that. And I think why he points that out time and time again is because it does conflict with his personal beliefs on vaccination. And he has to state that time and time again just to comfort himself and to reassure himself that, hey, my convictions on how I look at vaccine are not in conflict of how I look at Nazi Germany. And that's why he continues to do that. That's my opinion.
Are relevant, and I think we will get a test case. Maybe I'll argue it, maybe I won't argue it.
You're such an important voice. I really appreciate you taking this time to sort of explain where you're at. But
I've learned a lot from your questions. I mean, You've asked some very all fair and very probing questions, and I think we should continue to have this debate and this dialogue, and let's make rational, calculated decisions.
I agree.
And let's turn people against each other. But I've learned a lot from our conversation. So thank you very much for inviting me on for intelligent conversation.
I really appreciate it.
Good. Too rare. Good. Thank you.
So these are the conversations that we need to be having. And I really applaud Del Bigtree for managing effectively his questioning, his counter discussion, very professionally driven. And that's what's missing for the most part from today's discussion, today's debates, is that unfortunately, we get so emotionally charged, right? We get so emotionally charged that we result to insulting, to to name calling, to a person's physique and what they look like, those types of things are for small minds, right? Be able to articulate your argument, be able to articulate your debates effectively to influence someone else to see your side. And when you resort to name calling, to, all those shit, that crazy shit, you don't win arguments. You don't. It may make you feel better, right? But in the meantime, you don't. So I applaud Del for that. And obviously, Alan opened up a little bit and said, hey, look, your question really made me, rethink some things. I appreciate you guys listening in. I know it's late. By no means do I have all the answer to this, but what I will tell you is this, is that I think what's at hand is the last play. And the last play is, fundamentally changing the course of America. And that's what concerns me the most, the corrosion of our civil liberties, our freedoms, the same things that were orchestrated from post 9/11 that were created. And my biggest fear is that they use COVID-19 to do the very exact same things. And that's what's at risk. That's the true danger, in my opinion, that they're going to allow this for states to expand their medical practices, their screening, their contact tracing. They're all code words. Those are all code words for surveillance. And I know some people argue and say, well, why does the government need to do that? They may not need to do this. You don't understand those sickos and their minds and how they work. And that's my biggest fear. I have a separate monitor to my left that's managing the stream and the comments. So when you see me looking over to my left, that's because it's a separate monitor over there to look at the comments and the things that are popping up. Sunshine, I'm glad you like my shirt. Yeah, it's by where's the armband? It has a flag on one side to go to this side. There you go. Yeah, so it's by Rogue Athletics. Not affiliated with Rogue, but I like their workout and everything else like that. So thank you for listening in. I think this was a great conversation. So please like and share because we need to begin this debate now. Like, we cannot wait until 3 months, 6 months down the road as municipalities are beginning the process of opening things up, as people are returning to work. This concept that we have to wait, or that a vaccine is going to be a cure-all, is going to help us. I just still, to this day, just amazed at the lack of discussion in regards to preventive health care. And I know I'm saying this like a broken record. I say this a lot through podcasts and everything, but, eat healthy, exercise. It doesn't take a whole lot. I don't want to hear the excuse that you can't do this. I like Joe Rogan's argument that if you can walk to the fridge and grab food out, then you can exercise. And then most importantly, get some vitamin D in you, some vitamin C. Those are the best things to, for a lot of different health conditions that we're currently facing. So much love and respect to all of you. Thank you guys for tuning in. This is CJ, and I'm going to be signing out. I'll be back tomorrow with some other live streams. So God bless all of you and your families. Take care. Over and out.